We can go ahead and get started now, I guess. Welcome everyone to Wednesday webinars with the Utah Center for Legal Inclusion. We're excited to have you all back with us again. And if you weren't with us last week, we had a really interesting discussion with Professor Dane Thorley from BYU Law, who talked about judicial campaign finance and some of his research that he's been doing on in that realm, particularly in Texas and other areas where they elect their judges. But feel free to go back to the recording from last week and watch that if you're interested and weren't able to join us. As those of you that have been with us this month, as you know, we have been focusing on law and politics or law and government as a sort of lead up to the election that's coming in just a couple weeks. It's kind of crazy that it's almost here already, but we're really excited to have with us today Marina Lowe, who is Legislative and Policy Counsel at the ACLU of Utah. And I'm going to give just a really brief bio that includes portions of what is included on her bio on the ACLU of Utah website, and then we'll let Marina give us a little bit more introduction. I've heard from Marina a couple times in different CLEs and webinars and at different events that I've been to, and I'm excited to have her here with us today. Marina joined the ACLU of Utah as a staff attorney in March 2007. But before that, she worked with the Salt Lake Legal Defenders Association, which is the public defender's office in Salt Lake County in the appellate division. And in that capacity, she worked on numerous appeals for different clients, indigent clients, particularly drafting appellate briefs on issues such as the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures and constitutionality of Utah legislation and things like that. Prior to her time at LDA, Marina was an associate at the law firm of Morgan, Lewis, and Bacchius in San Francisco, which was a law firm where she concentrated her practice on commercial litigation as well as intellectual property counseling and litigation. And she also spent a significant part of her time there working for pro bono clients. So she's had a wide practice working both in the private sector for public defender's offices and now in the nonprofit world. And Marina grew up in Northern California and went to UC Hastings for law school. And before she went to law school, she spent some time working in marketing at Hewlett Packard in France. And now she is married and has 2 girls, which is so great. I have 4 boys, so I have no context for having girls, but I always love to have moms of girls on our, in my social circles. It's always fun to see the differences. But we're really excited to have Marina. And as per our tradition here on Wednesday webinars, I'm going to turn a few minutes over to Marina at the outset to give us a little bit of her own personal bio that she would give, and in particular, highlighting why she chose to go to law school and what her path looked like on that journey. So take it away, Marina.
Okay, thank you so much, Melinda, for having me, and for everybody for taking time from your afternoon to come and hear me talk. My path, I always remember growing up, my dad actually telling me that you're oftentimes your path in life is not sort of a straight line, and it often has to take different twists and turns, and that those twists and turns are important along the way. And I certainly think that's true with my career. I never really knew that I was going to be a lawyer. I come from a family of doctors, actually, and so just assumed when I went to college that I was going to be really great at math and science, and I was going to go to medical school. And I remember, I think it was midway through my freshman year in college, the provost of my college pulled me aside, and I think maybe he'd had some visibility on my organic chemistry scores. And, he said, I'm not sure this is the right track for you. And I went to a University of California school for undergrad. And the year that this happened, my freshman year, was the year that President Clinton was invited to give the graduation speech, the commencement speech, as an opportunity really to have a platform to talk about affirmative action and one of the propositions that was being considered in California that year. And so my provost handed me a ticket and he said, "Here, why don't you go and listen to him speak, and maybe that will inspire you." And I think it probably did. It certainly told me I was not on the right path. I was not meant to be a scientist or a doctor. And hearing a politician speak, maybe sparked something. And so when I graduated, I had a real interest in other countries and foreign language. I had studied abroad while I was in college. So I took a couple of years off and worked in France, which was an amazing experience. But knew that at some point I would have to come back to real life and figure out an actual career for myself. And so law school just seemed like a good option because it meant I had lots of options. Um, and, I'd come from a background where I had parents who were doctors and teachers, and I wasn't going to be a doctor or teacher myself, but those both feel like sort of service industries to me. And I felt like the law was a way that I could also be in a service industry in a way that felt more comfortable to me. So that was really the reason that I went to law school. I went to UC Hastings. I'm from California, so it sort of made sense for affordability and other reasons to go to school in my state. And I really loved it. I loved law school. I thought it was a really um, fun, collaborative, sort of experience. I went to a big law school. Hastings has class sizes of 400. So it's a bigger class than most law schools, I think, anywhere in the nation. But I really enjoyed my time there. And yeah, sorry, I got a little distracted. Do you want me to talk about how I landed in my career then after that?
Yeah, and maybe I find I always like to hear people's stories about how they make their way to Utah as well. So if maybe
Yes,
you can address that, that's helpful too.
they're intertwined.
Yeah, good.
So after law school, well, actually, I guess during law school, I sort of fell into the typical OCI process, the on-campus interview process, and really had never given a thought to working at a big firm. My parents, as I mentioned, were sort of in service industries, had worked in the Peace Corps, and sort of I fancied myself finding a way to have a legal career that would be in sort of similar vein. But I thought, what the heck, I'll just throw my hat in the ring. And sure enough, I got a job at a big firm, which was an amazing experience at that time in San Francisco. Sort of the summer associate program was booming, and I made a ridiculous amount of money in just a couple of months over the summer while I was wined and dined and taken to baseball games and wine tastings. And I thought, well, gosh, if this is big firm life, this is perfect. So I graduated and went to work at Morgan, Lewis and Bockius, which is a big firm. It's located primarily in their headquarters are in Philadelphia, and they have offices really all over the world. And I found it to be such a disappointment. Not only was it not what my summer associate time had been like, the things that I was excited about being a lawyer really didn't present themselves as a young lawyer in a big, coastal law firm. I had sort of imagined a lot of collaboration and time in a courtroom and things like that. And instead, I was in my office, sort of, drafting memos and doing research, which is of course the natural work that young lawyers do. But I wasn't particularly excited about a lot of my clients and the work that I was doing, and didn't feel like I was really giving back in the way that I wanted my legal career to do. Um, so while I was at the law firm, however, I met this guy who was just a year ahead of me, and he was from Utah. And he got a job offer a couple of years after we had started working at this firm in San Francisco back here in Utah, and convinced me to come with him. And so I did. I didn't have a job or anything, but I knew that I didn't want my future to be at this big law firm in San Francisco. And so it seemed like the perfect opportunity to sort of try something new. My parents were very anxious about me just having no job, but I figured that I would find my way, and that Utah would be a great opportunity for me to try something new. I'd actually really never been to Utah before, so it was a completely new experience. And I had no plans to come to Utah. It really wasn't on my radar, but it's been 14 years now, and I really can't picture any other place as home. So once I got here, um, I started looking for a job. I spent some time working at the Salt Lake Legal Defenders Association while I was studying for the bar. I had to take the bar again here in Utah. And because California doesn't have any reciprocity, so they require you to take it again. And then when I saw a job come up, a job opportunity at the ACLU, I really jumped at the chance because it seemed like exactly what I was looking for, an organization that I really believed in, and an opportunity to use my legal degree for reasons that I really cared about and to feel like I was having an impact and giving back to my community. So that's my story. I've been there ever since.
That's great. And what was, you were a staff attorney to start out with. Did you have a particular focus area that you were assigned to when you started there?
No, so when I first started at the ACLU of Utah, I think we had 4 staff
Oh,
members
wow.
total. We now have 14, 15, 16, something
Mhm.
like that, but it was really, really small. And at the time I started, the staff attorney's job description included handling all of our litigation and then also handling all of the legislative work while the legislature was in session, which was not only like an impossible job, but really not feasible. It meant that no litigation happened during the 45 days that the legislature um, was happening. And so the fact that it was impossible and the fact that I started a family soon thereafter provided a good opportunity for me to go to my boss and say, as strange as it may seem, I kind of like doing the legislative work
Mm.
and I'd be happy to focus just on that and work part time so that I can be with my children and have a more flexible schedule. And so made that transition at that point.
That's
And then they
great.
hired a couple more lawyers to take over all the litigation work. So,
That's really great. Yeah, I'm only familiar with ACLU currently, and so that is pretty shocking to hear, that's a lot of not possible work schedule. So
yeah.
that's great that we've come to this point now.
And
So
I
why
also
don't you
think probably
describe for us, oh,
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a woman attorney, I also think it's really interesting always to hear and explore different ways that women are making it work. Yeah,
Yes.
in terms of being able to have a legal career and also have children and be an important part of their lives. And I think it's a constant struggle.
Mhm.
So anyway, I'm so grateful that I've always had bosses who've allowed me to figure out ways to make it work for my personal situation, but hope that others have similar circumstances as well.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I love the story because it highlights that you have to be creative sometimes and just be willing to suggest something that may not have happened in the past, but that is certainly feasible and maybe just needs to be raised on people's radar to
Yep.
be seen as an option. So yeah, I think that's a really great point. So why don't you tell us about what you do now at the ACLU? What does your kind of day-to-day look like, and what's your role?
Yeah, so now I've sort of morphed into the Legislative and Policy Council, which means that I handle really all of the legislative work and any other policy matters that may arise on the local or county level. But really, the bulk of my work is focused on the state legislature. The Utah legislature meets for just 45 days a year, and those 45 days are absolutely crazy. I barely see my family. That's the trade-off, of course. I work around the clock during that time, but the rest of the year I have quite a bit more flexibility and pick my kids up from school every day. But even though the Utah legislature is part-time, the work really does happen all year round. Legislation is actively being drafted really starting as soon as April, after the session concludes in March. And so there are meetings, there are, stakeholder sessions to discuss different topics, drafting that goes on, all sorts of different conversations with lawmakers and others as we sort of develop an agenda for each upcoming session. So there really is a lot of work that happens on a day-to-day basis. But really gets pretty intense come January, of course.
Right, right. And maybe just for some of those on or that are attending that may be less familiar, what types of legislation are we looking at here? I heard you talk at the Women Lawyers event last week or a couple weeks ago about, reproductive rights and things like that. But what other areas of legislation are we talking about?
Yeah, so the ACLU has a pretty aggressive agenda when it comes to the topics that we address. We try to look at all new bills that are coming up or bills that we want to advance ourselves through the lens of the Constitution. So we're considering, First Amendment issues. Those could be anything from questions that issues that pertain to the media. Questions that may come up for different newspapers. Grandma questions, for example, always fall within that sort of category. Could be questions around the separation between church and state here in Utah. You might or might not be surprised to hear that that sometimes comes up at the legislature. So anything in the First Amendment realm is important. Protest issues, we had a bill just last session, in fact, dealing with questions about when individuals disrupt public meetings. So that's a real sort of solid First Amendment sort of issue that can arise. Tons and tons of Fourth Amendment issues, whether they be search and seizure questions. We're seeing this on the national stage, of course, too, with questions around forcible entry, such as the Breonna Taylor case. Criminal justice issues in general take up the bulk of my time. We work with a lot of different partners up at the legislature to advance all kinds of legislation that promotes and protects people's rights in the criminal justice arena. And it's been a really fruitful place for the ACLU to invest some time, because we have some really unique bedfellows when it comes to criminal justice reform, and so are able to make a ton of progress even in a very conservative state. Let's see, and just thinking about other amendments, Sixth Amendment issues are really important. Questions of indigent defense have been problematic for a long time in our state. Let's see, trying to think of reproductive rights, as you mentioned, of course, is tremendously important. And we almost always see legislation every year on that topic, usually restrictive measures. Questions around equality generally play a prominent role. Sometimes that looks like issues pertaining to LGBT equality. Of note, in the past few years, there have been a number of pieces of legislation dealing with transgender individuals. And so that's a place that we get involved. But equally so, we often see and work on issues to try and get better equality in the workplace, in particular for women. So have passed a number of bills around, breastfeeding rights in the workplace, pregnancy rights, and are continuing to try and work in that area in terms of questions around equal pay, discrimination, all of those sorts of issues. Most of those have been really sort of tough challenges in the Utah legislature to get passed. Voting rights is another big area where we've been able to make some progress, but also see some challenges. I'm sure I'm probably forgetting other topics, but it's a wide range of issues.
It's a very wide range. That's amazing. So maybe this is a good point to talk about a couple of things. First of all, how does your law degree, I mean, you've touched on a lot of constitutional amendments, certainly, but how do you see your law degree being a really important tool, I guess, in your work that you do? And how does it set you apart from maybe others who may be acting in a legislative advocacy type of role?
I personally find it incredibly important. As you rightly point out, there are lots of lobbyists who do not have a law degree, and it's certainly not a requirement. But particularly for the subject matter areas in which I work, I think a law degree is incredibly important for a number of reasons. One, just subject matter. It makes it a lot easier to sort of digest pieces of legislation when they pertain to sort of constitutional issues. Or oftentimes when I'm looking at trying to come up with arguments around bills, I'm looking at case law. I'm looking at, what are the cases around the country? How has this been decided elsewhere? And so having just sort of that general legal understanding and knowledge, I think is really important in terms of being able to quickly understand the landscape. And then just a lot of the skills that I think we learn as lawyers are tremendously helpful in terms of advocating. We tend to think of advocating in the courtroom, but things like being persuasive and public speaking and, having sort of an organized way that we organize our thoughts and, doing concrete research. These are all skills that I think are tremendously important. Negotiation, I mean, that comes up all the time when you're working with different stakeholders and lawmakers. And so those are all really important skills to bring to sort of a legislative arena. For me personally, too, when I'm working on very controversial issues, which almost all of my issues are, I feel like a law degree gives me sort of a neutral place to land when I'm talking with lawmakers. I can sort of step back and say, let's put aside how we feel politically on this issue. I'm here to tell you about the legal issues. I'm a lawyer. I can tell you that if you pass this law, there will be problems, that it's likely to be challenged in court. Here's why, here's the case law. And so it just feels like a little bit more objective place where I can sometimes root my arguments rather than just relying on, whether I think it's a good idea or not. I will say the legal the place where we give legal arguments typically in a court is so different from, delivering arguments at the legislature. And it can be a little bit of a wild ride for somebody who's used to a more formal
Yeah.
process. People interrupt you and cut you off, and it's just not what we're used to in sort of that more, professional, respectful environment that you see in a courtroom. But it can also be pretty fun.
So that's a good segue actually to one of our next questions. So next week we are going to have a panel that will include Representative Stephanie Pitcher, who's a legislator, and then 2 attorneys that work at the Office of Legislative Counsel. So they'll be talking about the work that they do in drafting the legislation and how they work together. But you have a different role. And so why don't you describe how you interact with those attorneys and representatives, and kind of what that day-to-day kind of looks like.
Yeah. So I work, first of all, with Stephanie a ton. We go way back, and have worked on several pieces of legislation together. We worked on that breastfeeding bill together that I mentioned. And then most recently, she passed a piece of legislation pertaining to bail, which was really important just last session. So we work very closely, and I work closely with almost all legislators. The biggest challenge in that regard always is making those relationships, getting to know legislators. Sometimes people ask me, especially during the session, what does your job look like? And I don't mean to make it sound unimportant, but in some ways my job is socializing. I'm up meeting legislators and getting to know them and helping them get to know me and trust me and realize that I can be a valued source for them of information. And that's challenging, especially when we have a legislature that can have a lot of turnover. It requires making those relationships all over again. My organization also comes with its own sort of stigma in a lot of conservative lawmakers' minds. And so I often have to get over that stigma, that initial stigma, and prove myself to them. And that can take a little while. And so that's one aspect of how I work with legislators. Once I have a relationship in place, it becomes much easier. And for many legislators, I do. I've been working up at the Capitol for over a decade at this point, and so do have long-term relationships, and then it makes it easy. I oftentimes will come to a lawmaker with a bill and say, I'd really appreciate to have you run this bill for me, and then we have questions back and forth between one another about sort of, first of all, whether they're interested in doing it, and then getting into the substance of the bill. It really depends with lawmakers how involved they want to be in that process. I have some lawmakers like Stephanie, for example, who are very involved in their legislation and they know the bill inside and out. And then I have others for whom I draft all their talking points and they read my statements word for word on the floor. And if they get questions, I'm on my cell phone so that I can text them the answer back so that they can answer. So it just really depends. Just on a legislator's preference. But we work closely. We work also with the attorneys in the legislative, the Office of General Counsel and Legislative Research very closely. And oftentimes legislators will just put me in contact with those attorneys directly for us to work out the details of a bill and to go back and forth to make sure we've got it right. And then the other piece, of course, it's not just the individual lawmaker who's running the bill and the attorneys who draft it, but then there are all the other folks who have an opinion about the bill. So stakeholders in the community, people who might oppose my bill, who I have to convince to get on board, other lawmakers. Every time a bill is heard in a committee, I want to have talked to all of those lawmakers ahead of time to make sure they understand the bill, that I've given them information, answered their questions, and hopefully figured out where they're going to vote on my bill. So yes,
okay,
lots and lots of interaction.
Yeah, and lots of individualized, it sounds like, attention to specific personality types.
That's correct.
So that's a whole skill set of its own, which is good to see that, attorneys have different skill sets for different jobs.
Yep.
So I think you hit on this in your last answer, but I do think there is maybe public perception of the ACLU in particular and lobbyists in general. Could you maybe speak to that and just maybe talk about maybe any misperceptions that you've seen and how you kind of counter or give some education to all of us about what you would say to counter some of those.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, even though I used it myself and called myself a lobbyist, it just feels
Mhm.
dirty. I always remind people that while I'm a lobbyist, I'm an extremely low paid lobbyist. So I feel like some of that dirtiness doesn't apply to me. Um, and my technical title is legislative counsel, part of which is because I wanted to reflect that I am a lawyer as well. But yeah, there is definitely stigma around that, with good reason. I mean, the sausage making process can be really gross at times. I feel very lucky in my role as a lobbyist for the ACLU that I don't get involved in a lot of those things. The ACLU doesn't give campaign contributions, for example. We don't have the budget to do that sort of thing. We don't take positions on candidates. We're entirely nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates. So it sort of frees me from all of those parts of the lobbyist job that feel a little distasteful. And so I really just consider myself in a lot of ways more of an advocate on issues. And really the only currency I have is not, paying for a table at a fancy event. It's really just the strength of my arguments, which goes back to why it feels important to be a lawyer. I just really have to have really good arguments and good relationships. And that's basically all I've got. In terms of the ACLU, it is hard in a state like Utah. I think people have a lot of preconceived notions. I had one lawmaker a couple of years ago. He always referred to me as UCLA. I think, at first it was sort of a joke, but then I think maybe it was just easier for him to mix up the letters and that felt better. I don't know, whatever. And I've had plenty of lawmakers too who try to make a distinction between me and my organization. So they'll oftentimes say to me, like, oh, I can definitely work with you. You're great. I trust
Mhm.
you. I don't know if I trust your organization. And I think they're thinking of a lot of the national headlines that they hear.
Right.
And so, I mean, this goes back to this idea of building relationships and gaining trust. And it just takes time. And I have worked really hard to generally, I feel like most lawmakers do have a favorable impression of at least our local affiliate and the work that we do legislatively. And the way that I do that oftentimes is, just people skills, of course, and figuring out how to have good relationships, but also by doing hard work, helping lawmakers, showing them that I'm going to be there for them when they have questions on bills. And when a question comes up, I don't just blow it off, but I provide them with a memo if they need it. Or if they have a question about a bill that comes up that has some constitutional angle, then I will get back to them with an answer. Or if I ask them to run a bill, I'm going to be there with all sorts of information, talking points if they want it. I will script everything out to show them that I'm a trusted source, and that I will be there. And I try to be consistent as well on my arguments. I think that's one of the things the ACLU prides itself on is our consistency.
Right.
And so, that sometimes has been a point of tension, I think, with the ACLU nationally in this particular moment in time, particularly around issues of, who we represent when it comes to
Mhm.
First Amendment issues. But in a lot of ways, that has bought us a lot of credibility with people on all sides of the spectrum, our willingness to sort of stand up for people regardless of their political backgrounds. And as I believe it was Rush Limbaugh once even said when we came to his aid, when he was trying to protect the privacy of his medical records, everybody hates the ACLU until they need them.
Right.
And pretty much, people need the ACLU at one time or another for one issue or another. So yeah.
I think that point was highlighted really well for those on the call or on the webinar that haven't seen it. The documentary, The Fight, that was made about the ACLU's work over the last few years. I think that was really highlighted well in that film to show representation of, white supremacist groups that may be very unpopular right now, or that you may not naturally connect with ACLU, but also for other groups that, may seem like a more natural fit. I think that's true that the consistency matters a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe this is related, maybe it's a different tangent, but do you have any specific experiences that you could share of like success stories where you feel like you had a specific bill or piece of legislation that you were really proud of, and it worked out the way that you wanted it to?
Yeah, happily, I do have a lot of those stories. And I have to say, it's taken a while. When we first started, working up at the Capitol, and really, I was the first ACLU lobbyist. We really hadn't done that before. We were just playing defense all the time. And so the idea of actually passing a piece of affirmative legislation seemed like a pipe dream. But those days are gone, happily, and we pass regularly quite a few bills every year. There are a few notable ones that stand out. And sort of particularly this year, this feels important. I worked, gosh, it took like almost a decade to get this bill passed. But we started working a number of years ago on this idea of election day registration, which would allow people to register on election day and then also cast a ballot. And previously, there was a registration deadline, and that was the deadline. And if you missed that deadline, you couldn't vote in the upcoming election. And you could register on election day, but that would just serve as a registration for the next year. And so, we had made this pitch for a number of years to lawmakers and to county clerks, like, why not just let people register and cast a ballot on election day? Technology has improved so much now that a lot of the reasons that we used to require registration for a period before the election have sort of disappeared. It's easy to sort of verify that somebody is who they are and that they live where they say they live. And so we might as well go ahead and count that ballot and let people participate in the election. This fell on deaf ears for a number of years, as is often the case at the legislature with really major pieces of legislation. I remember at one point taking a van full of legislators and county clerks up to Evanston, Wyoming, which had election day registration in place. And we went on a field trip and watched election day registration happening in person. It wasn't tremendously exciting, but Evanston is really small, and it was a pretty small election that we watched. But nevertheless, it was an important opportunity to sort of educate lawmakers and county clerks who had a lot of fear about some of the consequences that they saw in terms of workload and things like that arising from implementing this policy. But a couple of years ago, we managed to finally get it through. It was a good learning experience for me because we did it sort of incrementally. When we realized there was a lot of resistance still, we went with a pilot project where we allowed a few counties to opt in and try it out with a lot of data reporting on the back end so that we could answer a lot of the fears and concerns that we were hearing from people. And so a number of counties did opt in. In fact, some of the more populous counties, so we were covering like a pretty substantial amount of the Utah population. And we were able to show county clerks and lawmakers that, in fact, the sky hadn't fallen, that it actually really worked and made lives easier in a lot of ways for county clerks, to the point where when we actually pushed the legislation all the way forward statewide, a lot of county clerks were on board and actually supported the legislation and came out to speak to it. So that was a huge success, and one I'm very proud of, and one that I see now in this election that is such an important election, I think, for our state and for our country. It's really exciting to see in a lot of the graphics that I see on social media that Utah has a little star next to it when we talk about registration dates, and underneath it says, but Utah has election day registration, and you can go ahead and register and cast your ballot on election day as well. So
yeah, I have a lot of friends working in different states that are, trying to spread the word to register now because you might lose your chance. And then, I see the same graphics that make me feel proud that we have some greater access to voting than other places, for sure.
absolutely.
So, yeah, that is a big win. I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute. So I'm going to encourage any of the other participants to go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A if you have them. But while we're getting those questions, can you tell us what's coming up this next session? I'm not sure how much you can tell us of what's happening, but.
Yeah, lots of issues are already in the pipeline. Let's see. I mean, obviously, I think because of what we're seeing across this nation and what we saw over the summer, I think there are a lot of issues when it comes to sort of policing and questions around racism and how those two issues intersect. So I think that it's fair to say there will definitely be some issues and some some items to watch on that front. Um, Unfortunately, I suspect, given what's happening with the Supreme Court at the moment, we're likely to also see some anti-abortion legislation again. Although, frankly, I really scratch my head as to think what else could be done. Utah has really pushed forward when it comes to legislation in this arena, and there's really not that much more that it seems could be done. One area that we have worked on unsuccessfully for a number of years, but I hope that COVID may have changed people's minds a little bit, is on this question of providing, paid sick leave to employees and paid leave in other situations as well. For example, maternity leave and those sorts of things. But certainly sick leave, I think COVID really shines a light on why that's so critically important. So we'll probably be working in that area again. Let's see what else. A lot of sort of criminal justice related issues. We'll be working on a bill that deals with our prison population. One of the really sort of startling facts that we've discovered is that a pretty substantial chunk of our prison population is made up of people who are on probation and parole and violate one of the requirements of their probation or parole. And oftentimes these are really what we consider to be sort of technical violations, things that really don't speak to underlying criminality. It could be missing an appointment or something along those lines. But nevertheless, that violation triggers time back in prison, which is both problematic, I think, for that individual and also just for our state. That's tremendously a costly way to deal with those issues. So we'll be trying to tackle that issue. Who knows what else? There was a presentation today. Today's interim day at the legislature, so a lot of issues were raised along those lines. Questions around justice reinvestment, which was a pretty substantial piece of criminal justice reform legislation passed a few years ago, and really highlighting the fact that we didn't properly fund that effort. And so a lot of the treatment pieces that were supposed to help keep our prison and jail population low sort of lacking. I hope that'll be something addressed this session. Unfortunately, I think bail will be back on the table. I'll let Stephanie tell you all more about that next week, maybe. But I suspect that that's something that will be addressed again. We're looking at questions around use of force, law enforcement, questions around no-knock warrants, such as what happened to Breonna Taylor. Body cameras are always an important issue when it comes to policing. Those are just a few that I can think of. In the voting realm, I know one area that we are interested in looking at is this question about, for those of you who may have voted already, you have to sign the back of your envelope. And there are a lot of questions about what happens when you have like a signature mismatch, and are we making sure that there's enough opportunity for voters to cure any problems that may arise, and that they're being notified in a timely way so that they can make corrections. So
that's helpful. That's good to know. I've actually wondered that for myself. I'm going to submit my ballot next week, and I know my signature is probably slightly different than when I originally registered when I was 18, so yep. Hopefully that doesn't cause an issue for me, but
yep.
Okay, so we have one open question, and anyone else, please feel free to put them in there. We have a question that came to me directly that said, so what is your role with respect to other lobbyists? How do you work with other lobbyists from other groups?
Yeah, I work with them all the time. It's really a tremendously important resource. I mean, sometimes we're working in opposition to one another, depending on where we stand on an issue. But one of the things that I've also realized, sort of a strategy that I employ as the single lobbyist for the ACLU with so many issues, and in a lot of ways, I'm sort of the underdog up there. What I try to do is sort of like lobby the lobbyists also. A lot of the contract lobbyists who are paid lobbyists and who have tremendous access because of, the money that they spend and the clients that they represent. And so whenever an issue comes up, I'm always trying to think about who else would care about this issue, or how can I make them care about this issue? How can I make this issue their issue so that then they're lobbying on the bill with me? So I do that a lot, and it's been, surprisingly successful. And over the years, I've made great relationships with other lobbyists too. And one thing I've also noticed, sometimes there comes along these issues that feel so monumental and important that I've actually had lobbyists come up to me and offer to volunteer time to lobby on an issue. And the one that comes to mind is repealing the death penalty. We've run that a number of years, unsuccessfully so far. But in 2016, we probably came the closest ever to repealing it. And I had lobbyists literally coming up all over the place saying, I want to help. Give me a name of legislators you need to have talked to. I'll work them. Just, I'm happy to contribute. I want to be part of history. I want to be part of this.
Yeah.
So
where is that? I actually was teaching criminal procedure at the time, and we were kind of following that because we were talking about the death penalty and some of the states that were working on it. So where are we on that effort?
well, I think you'll see it introduced again this year. And, I'm an optimist. You have to be at the ACLU, but I do feel optimistic about it. And as I tell lawmakers every year, I have absolute certainty about the way the question around death penalty in the United States ends. It's that it ends, and it will end soon. It's just a question of when. It's just a totally broken system, and it makes no sense really in any way, financially,
Right.
morally, you name it. And so I see the practice ending soon. I hope it's this year.
Good. Well, that's great to know. And at least, I mean, that we could talk about this for a while, but I will say, I think it seemed like most states have just functionally stopped, but it
Yep.
would be helpful to have a clear, standard there.
That's
Um,
certainly the case for Utah. We pay for it, but we don't actually do it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so one more question. What's your favorite thing about your particular job?
Oh, favorite thing. Gosh. I mean, it's just really fun. Honestly, I really never knew this was a career one could have out of law school. It wasn't presented to me in law school in any way, shape, or form. But when I look back, I did a lot of moot court. And I think this is kind of maybe that was good training for me in that regard. Um, just standing up and thinking on your feet and having to argue on the fly and come up with good arguments to support your position. And in my case, it's hard to think about lobbying for anybody else because my issues are so fun and exciting. I mean, I'm not ever lobbying on sort of these drier issues, maybe about, I don't know, you name it, like some obscure question about water access or something. My issues are always the ones you see in the newspaper. They're interesting and they're noteworthy, and people want to talk about them and hear about them and have opinions about them. So the work just never gets boring. It can be really frustrating at times. I know that wasn't the question, but it can be hard working in a state like Utah, and it can be really hard because I care about all of my issues. There's not really a single issue that doesn't feel meaningful and important to me too, and that can be hard when you care so much about your issue. Sometimes I look at these contract lobbyists who are just paid to work on an issue, and it's like, if it passes or it doesn't, it's no big deal. But when some of these issues pass or don't pass, it feels so important because there are people's lives at stake and their welfare and their well-being. So it feels very meaningful.
Mm. So you said at the beginning of your answer that you weren't presented this as a career option in law school. Do you have any advice, or is there anything that students might be able to do? We do have law students that come back and watch these recordings, or that might be joining us today. Do you have any advice if someone is actually already thinking about this as a career option? Is there something that people can do, or some things, I guess, that people can do to set themselves up for a career like this?
Yeah. I mean, for one thing, what's amazing is, our legislature is part-time. And so with that, it means that they don't have staff. And so they rely on law students. Well, I don't even think they're law students. They rely on students in general to provide a lot of help to them. And so I think that's a great opportunity, is to figure out a way to work directly with a lawmaker. And there are probably opportunities that, it's great that you're having folks from the Legislative Research and General Counsel's office. That's probably a great place to think about an internship as well. You'd get an incredible sort of view on the legislative process and the work that's involved and the range of issues that they're dealing with there. I have so much respect for those attorneys. That's a tough job that they're doing. And then finally, I would say, working with groups like my own, I get requests every year to have interns work with me during the legislative session. And I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm sure lots of other nonprofits or even contract lobbyists are looking for students. And when it comes to the work that I'm doing, having legal interns who can do legal research is incredibly helpful. So I think there are lots of ways that students can get involved. The Utah legislature is incredibly accessible. Not right now because of COVID, it's a little harder. But in general, it's incredibly accessible because we have a part-time legislature. These are just everyday people who go back to their communities. They, their cell phone numbers are available on the website. It's really easy to have access to these folks, and so it means that it's easier for you and I and anybody who's interested to get involved in the process.
That's interesting. I never really thought about that. I think sometimes we take some of these things for granted and then we go other places and realize how different every state is in terms of legislative process and all of that.
Yeah.
So do you have I'll just ask one more call for questions and then I have one more. Do you have any role in national or federal legislation? And then for participants, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we can answer those. But if you have any role in federal legislation, I'd be interested to know.
Some limited. We have a whole office in DC that handles all of our federal legislation, but occasionally there are opportunities where they need information from us, or for example, we are often tasked with requests to reach out to our federal delegation to lobby on particular issues just because of relationships that we have here locally. So even just this year, I think I've had 3 or 4 different requests to reach out to Senator Romney, for example, Senator Lee, Representative McAdams, about legislation that the ACLU National is working on. When it comes to legislation locally here, sort of the flip side to that is that I rely on our national office all the time to help provide me with information. I have to be a generalist who can handle any and all issue. But the way that our national office is organized, we, as you saw in the fight, we have specialists. And so Bridget, for example, is the person I call when I have a reproductive rights issue, or that somebody in the LGBT office is who I call when I see a bill pop up that pertains to that issue. So really a good partnership both ways.
Interesting. Okay. Well, it looks like we've wrapped up all of our questions, unless someone else, I'll give just like 10 seconds for people to give a little bit more. But thank you so much, Marina, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It's been really interesting. For those on the call and those listening to the recording later, like I said, next week at 4, we'll have attorneys, and I always get the full name of the office wrong, but the Office of General Counsel and Legislative Research. So we'll have 2 attorneys from that office come and speak to us, along with Representative Stephanie Pitcher, who's a Democratic representative here in Utah, and they'll be talking about the process. And then in November, we'll start a new theme for the month, which will focus on the judiciary, and we'll be hearing from a whole host of judges about the different types of courts and what they do as judges, how they came to be judges. So I think that'll be a really interesting set of speakers as well. But thank you again, Marina, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take care.